This material has been reproduced and communicated to you by or on behalf of the Australian National University, in accordance with Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. The material in this communication may be subject to copyright under the Act. Any further reproduction or communication of this material by you must be consistent with the provisions of the Act. Do not reproduce this material. Do not remove this notice.
Hi everybody, my name is Martin Amidy and I'm going to be talking to you today about a project that we did with some iceds seed funding, which was called Transition to a Roadmap for a Socially Just Energy Transition within the agricultural sector. It was a collaboration between BizGip, CEAT, the School of Cybernetics and the Recent School of Politics and International Relations. So the key challenge that we're really looking at in a nutshell was climate change. So agriculture is one of the sectors that's most affected by climate change moving forward, and it's also a sector that has a significant emissions profile, and it's also considered a hard to abate sector of the economy. So from an industry point of view, they've made commitments around carbon neutrality. So a lot of industries like red meats and pork and grains have identified where they want to be, which is carbon neutral in a particular time frame. But they need to identify the potential pathways to get there. And one of the limitations they have is around the lack of technical knowledge in energy systems within the sector and industries more specifically, compared to those other emission sources like soils and enteric methane that they understand very well because of their knowledge of those systems and how they operate within their production environment. So the key aims that we're looking to achieve with the project were really around engaging with stakeholders to understand the complexity of the challenge from their perspective. And identifying those stakeholder needs. So what do stakeholders want to get out of this project and what would they want to get out of a roadmap? One of the key components was validating the need for a roadmap from an industry point of view and a stakeholder perspective and what the key elements that they would want to have in a roadmap. And then also understanding how the ANU can help. So what's our role and how can we deploy the world-class capability of the ANU and across our wider networks to support an energy transition in the agricultural sector. So the approach we used was interdisciplinary systems and user-centric. So from an interdisciplinary point of view, we had a team from 4 different entities at the ANU, consisting of 10 people from across 3 ANU colleges. From a systems point of view, really important to understand the complex and dynamic nature and interconnectivity between the different components of the system and the flow and impacts of system change. And that's really important when we're talking about identifying those flows of costs and benefits of system change to different stakeholders to identify how equitable those distribution of those benefits and costs are, and getting people on board for a transition by reducing those barriers to adoption. Again, user-centric, engaging with stakeholders early and often to co-design and co-create solutions to drive adoption and change over time, and really identifying that it's a diverse group of stakeholders that we need to engage as part of the process, from farmers to energy providers and retailers, industry groups, governments, and also academia and business and local communities as well. So from a process perspective, we went through a literature review. We then developed a conceptual model for the current energy system, which you can see up here at the top of the right. We then moved through to stakeholder engagement and feedback on that model, and we iterated and refined that model, iterations over a period of time. And then we developed a future state model, so looking at opportunities for transition within that to go from existing fossil fuels within that model through to a renewable only system at the end there. Some of the key findings that we had from an industry point of view was that they still feel they're in an information gathering stage. So they felt they need to know more about the transition opportunities before they could engage in a meaningful discussion around viable transition pathways. Multiple pathways and tools will be required. So each industry and individual farm has its own unique operating environment, and it's critical that they'll need a broad toolkit of transition options to create their own bespoke transition pathways. Another part of that is that it is a transition and it will take time. So acknowledging that there might be long-term solutions that aren't currently technically or economically feasible and may not be for decades. So are there intermediate steps we can take to move towards a transition? An example that might be a direct transition is something like pumping water, where you're going from diesel to solar, relatively mature technologies and a fairly short-term to medium-term transition for most businesses. Something more long-term and indirect might be something like a combine harvester on a wheat farm, where you're currently using diesel. From an intermediate point of view, you might use biogas that's created on farm, and then longer term there might be an opportunity around battery electric. Once the weight of batteries and their capacity increases, the weight gets lighter, and then also being able to deliver the same energy and horsepower and torque required within those machines. The importance of policy and regulation was another key one, so identifying what those barriers are from a energy generation on farm and a use on farm perspective. Identifying that there's a broader energy infrastructure need as well from an industry perspective. So having access to fit for purpose distribution infrastructure will be really important to be able to match the ability to supply energy on farm and the demand required either on grid or off grid. And that can be through a number of mechanisms, both the grid, but then also distribution networks for things like hydrogen and gas and those kind of energy resources as well. And the opportunity there for agriculture to contribute more broadly to the economy transition. So once the sector builds these on-farm assets around battery storage and energy production, there's an opportunity for them to provide generation storage and grid stability services to other businesses and households in the economy. Next step, so from our point of view, we're looking to put together a transition symposium later in the year. So we'll be bringing together stakeholders to discuss the findings of the project and also workshop plan to develop a transition roadmap. Building scenarios and case studies using BizGIP's Echo modelling framework are really important to that. So stakeholders can identify what the impacts of those different transition pathways might be. And then we'll also, between now and the symposium, go out for a second phase of industry engagement. So the project team will provide the draft report to stakeholders and then get some additional feedback before working with stakeholders to design the symposium that we'll look to run later in the year. Thanks for your time.